There is a file. It exists in 17 different classification tiers across 9 different galactic governments, and every single one of them has stamped it with a variation of the same word. Restricted. Not dangerous. Not sensitive. Not even classified, which implies someone somewhere has clearance. Restricted. As in, we have decided, collectively, across species lines and political borders that have outlasted 3 galactic wars, that the fewer beings who read this, the better. I read it anyway. I was a strategic observer, 3rd designation, in the service of the Valhari Cooperative. My job was to watch conflicts unfold and write clean, bloodless reports about them. Numbers. Casualty ratios. Resource expenditure. The kind of document that lets counselors sleep. I have not slept properly in 4 years. The file is not about what humans do in battle. Every species fights. Every species bleeds. Every species has produced, at some point in its history, something that impressed or horrified its neighbors. The file is about something else entirely. It's about what happens when you study them long enough, when you sit in the dark with their feeds, their transmissions, their intercepted audio, their after-action reports written in that strange flat language of theirs, and you start to notice the thing underneath the fighting. The thing that the Council spent 40 years arguing wasn't real. I am going to tell you what I found. Not because I was ordered to. Not because it will make you feel safe. Because I think you deserve to be unsettled by the right thing, rather than afraid of the wrong one. What follows is my account. Unredacted. Unsubmitted. Session log, personal archive only. If you're reading this, you found it yourself. That means you were already looking. Good. The first human I ever observed in a real combat situation was not doing anything heroic. He was eating. This is not a metaphor. There is no clever setup here. Sergeant Davencor's human, male, approximately 32 standard years, assigned to the 14th Expeditionary under the Joint Peacekeeping Mandate on Veth Station, was sitting on an overturned equipment crate in the middle of what had been, 6 hours prior, an active firefight. The walls around him were still hot. The floor had a long dark stain that I will not describe in detail. 3 of his unit members were dead in the corridor outside, and the tactical situation had not yet resolved. And he was eating something wrapped in crinkled silver material, chewing methodically, staring at the far wall with the expression of a being waiting for a transport that was running 3 minutes late. I remember I wrote it into my log at the time, in my small obsessive way, the way I always annotate things that don't fit the models. Unit appears to be consuming food. Emotional state, indeterminate. Does not appear distressed. Assessment, unclear. Revisit. I revisited it 847 more times over the next 4 years. My name is Sarav Ohan. I will not bother you with the full designation. I am 3rd-tier strategic observer for the Valhari Cooperative, which sounds more impressive than it is. I watch. I record. I file reports that travel up a chain of command so long and so bureaucratically tangled that by the time any action is taken on my recommendations, the situation I observed has usually evolved into 3 new situations, 2 of which are worse. I drink something the humans call coffee. This began as a research exercise, understand the stimulant habits of the observed species, note their dependency patterns, standard profile work, and became, somewhere around month 7 of the Veth Station posting, a genuine and slightly shameful necessity. It tastes like burnt bark soaked in regret. I have 3 cups before I begin any log session. My supervisor has mentioned, twice, that my requisition forms for cooperative imported earth commodities are unusual. I told her it was for research. She believed me. I believed me too, once. Back to Sergeant Kors. The firefight had started because of a supply dispute that had metastasized, the way these things do, on contested stations, into something with sides and flags and casualties. The aggressors were Drevathi separatists, technically allied with the cooperative, which made the political situation exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds. My job was to observe and not interfere. The humans were there under a mandate that gave them authority to stabilize the situation, which is diplomatic language for, please handle this, we'd rather not. The 14th Expeditionary had entered the station from the tertiary dock. 9 soldiers. The Drevathi had 43 armed personnel, station knowledge, and 6 hours to prepare. I had already written, in my preliminary notes, the phrase expected casualty ratio unfavorable for human contingent. I was not wrong about the casualties. I was wrong about everything else. The first thing I did not understand was the silence. When the Drevathi entered the corridor where Korza's unit had positioned themselves, the humans were quiet. Not disciplined quiet. I know what disciplined silence looks like, the held breath, the coiled readiness. This was something different. It was the quiet of things that have already decided. Like a door after it's been shut. The Drevathi commander, I had his file, secondary level, standard threat assessment, hesitated at the entrance to the corridor for 11 seconds. 11. I counted. I count things. His own unit noted the hesitation in their internal comms, which I was monitoring. One of his subordinates said, and I am translating loosely from Drevathi second dialect, "What's wrong with you? Why are you stopping?" He said, "They're not moving." His subordinate said, "Good. Move in." He didn't move for another 4 seconds. Later, when I went back to try to understand what he had sensed, because he had sensed something, I'm certain of it, the gap in his behavior was not arbitrary. I could only identify one thing different about the human position. Not their number. Not their weapons. Not their formation, which was honestly suboptimal given the geometry of the corridor. They were still. Not frozen. Not rigid. Not the stillness of fear or exhaustion. It was something more unnerving than either of those, something I spent a great deal of time trying to name before I gave up and just wrote it into my log as is. The humans appeared to have made a decision that the outcome was already settled. They were waiting for the Drevathi to figure that out. Here is what I knew about Sergeant Kors before that day. His service record was unremarkable on paper. 12 years in. 2 previous postings in contested zones, both resolved without major incident. Commendations for performance in 3 separate operations, the citations for which were bureaucratic and vague in the way military commendations always are. Demonstrated exceptional resourcefulness under adverse conditions means absolutely nothing, and yet somehow I read it 4 times. 1 incident flag, an unauthorized action during the Palath corridor engagement 2 years prior, in which Kors had deviated from the extraction plan to recover the body of a unit member when the tactical situation explicitly did not support it. The flag noted this had extended the operation by 40 minutes, endangered 2 other unit members, and ultimately succeeded. The flag did not know what to do with the fact that it had ultimately succeeded. You could feel the report's discomfort in the passive voice it used. The action was completed. The body was recovered. Disciplinary review was conducted and no further action was taken. No further action. Because he got the body back. I had read this and logged it under Human Anomalous Risk Assessment Review further and then mostly forgotten it until I was standing in my observation post watching Sergeant Kors sit on a crate and eat what his unit later told me was called a protein bar, which is the most aggressively utilitarian name for a food item I have ever encountered. The Drevathi commander sent 2 scouts forward. Standard procedure. Smart. The scouts reached the halfway point of the corridor, saw the humans clearly, and stopped. The humans looked at them. That's all. No threats. No weapons raised. No aggressive posturing. 3 of Kors's unit were visible, the others were positioned in the side junctions, which the scouts couldn't see and certainly knew they couldn't see, and the not seeing was doing something to the scouts that I found fascinating to watch. They kept looking at the visible humans and then looking at the junctions and then looking back at the humans. Kors picked up his protein bar from where he'd set it down and took another bite. One of the scouts said something on the Drevathi comms channel that even my translation matrix flagged as uncertain. The closest rendering was, "They look like they're waiting for us." The other scout said, "For us to do what?" First scout, "I don't know." The commander pulled both scouts back. This was not in any combat model I had run for this engagement. 43 personnel with position advantage pulling back from 9. I checked my equipment. I reran my probability assessments. I added a note to my log: Drevathi commander has withdrawn forward scouts. Tactical explanation unclear. Revisit. What happened next took 4 hours. The Drevathi repositioned. The humans didn't. The Drevathi tried 2 feints, both of which the humans read and didn't respond to, not with counter-tactics, not with aggression. They just didn't react. Which is somehow more destabilizing than if they had. I kept watching the Drevathi comms. The tactical chatter was becoming less and less tactical. At one point the commander asked one of his senior officers what the humans were doing, and the officer said he didn't know, and the commander said neither do I, and that was a genuine moment of bilateral confusion that I wrote into my log in very small text because it felt important in a way I couldn't yet articulate. The humans, for their part, were doing almost nothing. One of them, a young woman, Private Tesche, 19 years old and 7 months in service, which even for humans is a genuinely short amount of time, was reorganizing the contents of her equipment pack. Sorting. By what criteria I could not determine. Another was asleep. Asleep. I have the sensor logs. Heart rate, 22% below baseline. Metabolic indicators consistent with genuine sleep, not medically induced downtime or combat stimulant crash. She was asleep in a corridor where 3 of her colleagues were dead and 43 armed opponents were regrouping 40 meters away. I wrote, human physiology or psychology appears to have a functional relationship with threat and rest that does not conform to standard stress response models. Flag for medical review? Flag for psychological review? Flag for everything. Flag everything. The Drevathi made their actual push in the 4th hour. It was a reasonable plan. 3-pronged entry, heavy pressure on the main corridor, secondary teams through the junction access points. Tactically sound. Numerically advantaged. The kind of thing that should have worked. Here is the thing about the junction access points. The humans had been in that station for 11 hours before the engagement started. They had 11 hours to walk around, and, apparently humans, or at least this particular group of them, cannot be in a space without touching every part of it. Their sensor logs showed movement through nearly every accessible section of that station section in the first hours. I had noted this in my preliminary report as familiarization behavior, standard pre-engagement assessment, and moved on. I should have thought harder about what 11 hours of touching every wall and walking every corridor actually means. The Drevathi secondary teams hit the junction access points and found them blocked. Not locked. Not defended with weapons. Blocked. With, and I want to be precise here, because the material list in the subsequent report is one of my favorite things I have ever filed: a weight-bearing arrangement of salvaged storage containers, a section of decommissioned environmental conduit, 2 standard load cargo straps rated to 4,000 Kelvin pull tension, and what the human debrief later described as whatever else was lying around. Jury-rigged. That's the human term. I learned it that day. The Drevathi couldn't shift it in time. The secondary teams were neutralized as a tactical factor not by soldiers or weapons but by a pile of garbage that 3 humans had assembled at some point in the quiet 4 hours while the Drevathi were regrouping. The main corridor push ran into the visible 9. It was not a long fight. Afterward, after the Drevathi commander had requested parley, which Kors had granted with the air of someone who had been expecting the request, which he probably had, I watched Kors walk the corridor where the blocked junctions were. He stopped at his own improvised barricades and looked at them for a moment. Private Tesche, the one who'd been asleep, came up beside him. She looked at the pile. She said something. I had audio, partial translation. You think that's going in the report? Kors said, the part where it worked, yeah. She laughed. It was a short sound, a little sharp, not particularly loud. The kind of laugh that knows the thing it's laughing at isn't funny. He didn't laugh. He just started walking again. I filed my report. I included the barricade materials list. I included the scout hesitation data. I included the sleep readings. My supervisor sent back a note that said, recommend revision of Section 4, casualty projections were significantly off. Please recalibrate your modeling parameters. I sent back, I believe the modeling parameters are correct. The subject population is the parameter that requires review. She did not respond to that for 6 days. I want to tell you about cores at the parley. The Drevathi commander Hathrak, I had his full file by then, was not a small being. Drevathi are built in a way that makes most environments feel like they were designed for someone else's comfort. Hathrak had that quality of physical presence that functions as its own kind of argument. He came to the table with the bearing of someone who had spent decades having rooms go quiet when he walked in. He sat across from Kors. Kors was not small for a human, but he was not large either. Medium, I suppose. He'd cleaned the worst of the corridor off his uniform. He still had his protein bar, half-eaten, sitting on the table beside his water container, which struck me as either phenomenally disrespectful or completely unconscious, and I still genuinely don't know which. Hathrak opened by saying, and, again, I'm translating, that the station dispute was a resource allocation issue with political dimensions and he wanted to explore a resolution framework. Kors said, okay. Hathrak seemed to expect more than okay. There was a pause. Kors said, what do you need? Not what are your demands. Not what's your position. What do you need? I wrote it down verbatim the moment he said it. I'm not sure I fully understood why it landed differently than the alternatives, but it did. Hathrak's posture changed. Something went out of him, not weakness, more like the particular tension of someone who arrived expecting a fight and has to recalibrate. The parley took 40 minutes. It resolved in terms broadly favorable to the cooperative mandate, which is to say it resolved in a way that let Hathrak keep something and gave the cooperative what it actually needed. Kors proposed most of the resolution structure. He did it in a flat, practical way that made it sound less like he was winning and more like he was pointing at a door that had always been there. After Hathrak left, one of Kors's unit, Corporal Vaz, who I had categorized as taciturn and would later revise to watchful, said to Kors, you gave him the processing rights. Kors said, we didn't need the processing rights. Vaz said, we could have kept them. Kors, yeah. That was the end of the conversation. I replayed the exchange 11 times. I could not figure out, at the time, whether it was tactical generosity, give them something so they don't come back, or something else. Something that didn't have a clean slot in my analytical framework. I wrote, consider whether human negotiation strategy operates from a different value hierarchy than standard diplomatic models. Define what do you need as a distinct opening gambit. Do they actually mean it? I still don't have a clean answer. The after-action report took me 3 days. I have a habit, my supervisor calls it a flaw, I call it accuracy, of including observations that are technically outside the scope of standard reporting. Tactical anomalies. Behavioral outliers. The sleep readings got included. The barricade materials list. The 11 seconds the Drevathi commander hesitated at the corridor entrance. I also included something I had not originally planned to. At the end of the engagement, when the surviving Drevathi personnel were being processed through disarmament protocol, one of them was a young male, juvenile by Drevathi standards, barely into legal combat age, which is a number I will not think too hard about. He had a wound on his forearm that had been bandaged, poorly, with whatever he had on him. He was standing in the disarmament line trying very hard to look like he wasn't doing anything, which is a very effective way of looking like you're doing something. Kors walked past him. Stopped. Looked at the bandage. The young Drevathi male went very still. The expression on his face, I have it in my visual log, frame by frame, was something I spent a long time trying to categorize. Not fear. Not exactly. More like the expression of someone who has already decided what the next thing is going to be and is braced for it. Kors said something I only got partial audio on. My translation matrix gave me, unclear, medic, unclear, look at that. He was calling his medic over. The Drevathi male did not understand, at first, what was happening. The medic, a broad-faced human woman named Sergeant Fila who I would come to know much better over the following months, came over, looked at the bandage, made a face at it that I can only describe as professionally offended, and proceeded to redo it properly. The young Drevathi male stood there while a human redressed his wound and did not appear to know what to do with his hands. Kors had already moved on. I put it in the report. My supervisor flagged it as outside reporting scope. I moved it to my personal archive instead. It is still there. I look at it, sometimes. I look at it and I think about the Drevathi commander hesitating at the corridor entrance, and the scouts saying they're waiting for us, and the way Kors said what do you need, and the protein bar sitting on the table, and the pile of garbage that wasn't garbage anymore. I think about what it means that the things I cannot categorize are all the same species. 3 weeks after the vet station engagement, I was reassigned. Routine rotation, I was told. My performance had been noted favorably. New posting, Observation Unit 7, Karev Contested Zone. Higher profile. Better resources. The 14th Expeditionary was also being redeployed. Different sector. I filed a formal request to have my new assignment adjusted to overlap with the 14th's deployment zone. My supervisor asked why. I said, ongoing research. Incomplete pattern analysis. She said, your report on Veth Station was thorough. I said, my report on Veth Station is the first page. She approved the request. I don't think she understood what I meant. I'm not sure I did either, not fully, not yet. But I had started to understand that there was a page 2. And 3. And that whatever was written on those pages was something the cooperative standard reporting frameworks did not have words for yet. I made a third cup of coffee before I started the next log. It tasted like burnt bark soaked in regret. I drank all of it. The Karev Contested Zone is not a place. It is a diagnosis. Technically it refers to the 6-system cluster along the inner rim where 3 different territorial claims have been legally unresolved for 114 years. In practice it means that whoever you talk to about Karev uses the same tone of voice they'd use to describe a structural problem in their residence that they cannot afford to fix and have long since stopped trying to fix and have instead simply arranged their furniture around. I was briefed by a Valhari administrator who said, approximately, it's contained. Everything in Karev is contained. That's our current goal. Containment. I asked, contained at what level? He said, at the level it's currently at. I wrote in my log, managed catastrophe. Flag for ongoing monitoring. Try not to become emotionally invested in outcomes here. I became emotionally invested in outcomes here. The 14th Expeditionary arrived in Karev 11 days after I did. They were assigned to what was officially designated a forward stabilization presence on a contested installation called Karev 7, which had changed hands 4 times in 6 years and currently held a civilian population of approximately 3,000 beings of 7 species who had nowhere else to be and knew it. I positioned myself in Observation Suite C on the adjacent satellite. I made my coffee. I started my log. Sergeant Kors was not in the first transport. I noted this without judgment and then immediately cataloged my own noting of it as a data point about my own observational biases that I should probably flag for internal review. I did not flag it for internal review. He was in the second transport. He came down the ramp last. This appeared to be habit. I would later notice he always came down last, walked at the back of formations, positioned himself at the rearmost point of any moving group. For a moment I thought it was command posture, keeping eyes on the unit. Then, I noticed he wasn't watching his unit when he did it. He was watching the environment they were moving into. Not the threats. Not the tactical high points. The environment. The full picture. I wrote, persistent rearward positioning. Observation behavior rather than command behavior. Builds complete situational picture rather than target picture. Compared to standard threat assessment protocols, significant divergence. Then, I made myself stop annotating and watched what was actually happening. The situation on Karev 7 was, in the administrator's terminology, contained. What it was actually was a slow-cold standoff between a HFY mining consortium that claimed the installation under a conditional grant that had technically lapsed, a Drevathy Community Council that had been running the installation's water processing for 11 years under an informal arrangement, and a Valhari Oversight Committee that existed primarily in documentation and not at all in physical presence. This is the kind of situation that stabilizes into permanent low-grade tension and, then, unstabilizes the moment anyone tries to actually solve it. The 14th's job was, per their mandate, maintain neutral presence, facilitate open dialogue between parties, support civilian safety and uninterrupted critical services. Corporal Vaz, who was becoming something of an anchor point in my observational notes, read this mandate aloud to his unit on their first morning and then put it down and said, "So babysitting." Private Tesche said, "I've babysat. Kids are easier." Kors said nothing. He was looking at a map of the installation's water processing sections. The first incident happened on day 4. I am going to call it the thing with the door because that is what the humans called it, in their after-action debrief, and it has the advantage of being accurate without being dramatic. The HFY consortium had a representative on station, a middle manager named Veth Karali, who had the energy of someone who had been sent somewhere to solve a problem they did not create and did not understand and was resenting every second of it. He had tried, in his first 3 days, to access the water processing sections twice. The Drevathy Community Council had, both times, politely declined to let him in. The diplomatic language exchanged in these encounters was technically civil and practically lethal. On day 4, Garali decided to bring 2 of the consortium's private security contractors with him. The Drevathy Community Council responded by having 6 of their own people at the water processing entrance. I watched this from my observation suite and wrote, in a tone I am not proud of, escalation pattern initiated. Standard sequence. Projected outcome, physical confrontation within 40 minutes or tactical withdrawal and resumption of legal challenge within 24 hours. Alerting 14th Duty Officer. The 14th Duty Officer was Kors. He came around the corner of the water processing section corridor exactly 3 minutes after I sent the alert. He had, apparently, been in that part of the station already. He was also holding a container of something hot, not his terrible coffee, something the station served, I checked later, apparently a local herb preparation that the Drevathy community used socially. He walked up to the standoff. He did not walk up to Garali. He walked up to the Drevathy community lead, an elder named Tesra, 73 years old, who had been running water processing on Karev 7 for 22 of them, and handed her the container. She looked at it. She looked at him. He said something I got full audio on, "Thought you might want one." She said, "You brought me tea." He said, "The woman at the service point said you usually have it around now." There was a pause during which I could see, I had a good angle, Garali's face cycling through several responses before settling on confused. Tesra took the container. She said, "The processing review is scheduled for day 11. Per the current shared services agreement." Kors said, "Right." He turned to Garali. He said, "Day 11. Garali said, "The agreement is under legal challenge." Kors said, "Is the challenge resolved?" Garali said, "Not yet." Kors said, "Day 11, then, dot." He stood there. This is the part one wrote down immediately, he did not move. He did not make any gesture toward the security contractors or the Drevathy community members. He simply stood there, between them, with the posture of someone who had made a scheduling decision and was waiting for the calendar to confirm it. Garali looked at his contractors. His contractors looked at the Drevathy community members. The Drevathy community members were looking at Tesra, who was drinking her tea. Garali left. Here is the thing. I have reviewed that footage hundreds of times. I have shared it with 2 other analysts at my supervisor's request, after I flagged it as tactically significant. Both analysts concluded, separately, that Kors had employed a standard third-party de-escalation protocol, and cited 3 similar documented cases in Valhari peacekeeping history. I disagree. The standard third-party de-escalation protocol involves positioning a neutral party between conflicting groups and verbally acknowledging both sides' grievances in a structured format. There is a sequence. There is language designed to acknowledge and redirect. It is taught at the Valhari Strategic Institute and it takes 4 weeks. Kors did not do any of that. He brought an old woman a hot drink that she would have wanted at that particular time of day because he had spoken to someone who knew her routine and asked. And then, he stood there. The standing there was doing something. Something I spent weeks trying to name. It wasn't intimidation, he wasn't projecting aggression. It wasn't positioning, he wasn't blocking anyone. It was something closer to what I eventually wrote as passive assertion of the settled state. The presence communicated that a decision had been made, that the decision was day 11, and that this was simply true in the same way that gravity is true. He didn't argue Gorali down. He didn't threaten the contractors. He walked into the room having already decided how it ended and waited for everyone else to catch up. Tessera, I noticed, seemed to have understood immediately. She started drinking before Gorali left. She was not watching the door. Day 7. One of Gorali's security contractors was involved in an altercation with a Drevathi young male in the station's common area. The details are disputed. The undisputed facts are, something broke, it was loud, and 11 people were in proximity, 6 of them Drevathi, 2 of them 14th Expeditionary, 3 of them from neither group and not wanting to be. Private Tezche was one of the 2 14th personnel present. I want to describe what she did because I didn't understand it until later. She walked into the middle of the common area, not between the contractor and the Drevathi male. She stepped slightly to the side and sat down on the floor. On the floor. In the middle of the common area. With her back against a support pillar, legs stretched out, in the posture of someone who was planning to be there for a while. Everyone looked at her. She looked at the ceiling. The Drevathi young male, whose name was Karen and who was 17 and already had 2 official conflict notations in the station management records, said, "What are you doing?" Tezche said, "Nothing." He said, "On the floor?" She said, "Yep." The contractor, whose name I never got because he was transferred off station 6 days later, said, Is she the other 14th member, who I had in my notes as Specialist Darrow, said, "She does this." There was a pause. Tezche was still looking at the ceiling. She appeared to have found something genuinely interesting up there. Whether or not there was anything genuinely interesting up there, I cannot confirm. Karen looked at the contractor. The contractor looked at Karen. Whatever momentum had been in the room had done something, gone somewhere, dissipated into the very strange situation of a soldier sitting on the floor looking at the ceiling, and rebuilding it would require both of them to mutually agree to rebuild it in front of witnesses, and that agreement was apparently not available. Karen left. The contractor left from the other side. Tezche stayed on the floor for another minute. Then, she got up, dusted off her uniform, and went and got something from the food service area. I wrote 4 different attempts at explaining what she had done, deleted all of them, and wrote, Private Tezche employed, unknown technique. Effect, complete emotional disruption of developing conflict. Method, intrusion of irrelevant, non-threatening behavior at critical escalation point. The absurdity of the behavior forced both parties to recalibrate their emotional state to accommodate an input that did not fit the conflict's script. Filed as, interrupt maneuver, type unclassified. I named it the floor gambit in my personal notes. I have seen 3 other humans use variants of it since. None of them appeared to be doing it deliberately. I think it might just be something they do. On day 9, I had my first direct conversation with Sergeant Kors. This was technically outside my role parameters. Strategic observers are not supposed to make contact with observed parties during active observation periods. It introduces variables, affects behavior, compromises data purity. My supervisor would have described it as a protocol violation. My supervisor was not on car F7. What happened was, I was in the station's lower corridor, returning from a secondary observation point, and I walked around a corner and he was there, alone, leaning against the wall reading something on a handheld device. He was off rotation. He had the particular quality of stillness he had in corridors before things happened, but softer somehow, less loaded. He looked up. I said, and I am reproducing this from my own log, which I started immediately after I apologize. I am a Valhari observer attached to the Oversight Committee. I will go. He said, you've been watching us. This was not a question. I said, yes. He said, since Veth Station. I said, yes. There was a pause. He looked back at his device. He said, there's water dispensers at the next junction. The hot preparation is better than it looks. And that was the end of that. I stood there for a moment. Then, I went to the water dispensers. The hot preparation was, in fact, significantly better than it looked. I added to my log, subject is aware of observation. Does not appear disturbed by observation. Is either A. performing non-reaction for strategic reasons or B. genuinely does not find surveillance by an alien intelligence particularly remarkable. Neither option is fully explicable. I drank the hot preparation and went back to my suite. Day 11 came. Gorali brought his contractors again. This time there were 4. Tesra had 8 community members at the water processing entrance. Korza's full unit was elsewhere in the station, dealing with a separate situation involving a disputed equipment shipment that had arrived on the wrong manifest. I have notes on that too, but they are for another session. The relevant fact is, Kors was not at the water processing section. Private Tesche was. Her and Darrow, routine patrol rotation. They arrived at the water processing entrance approximately 4 minutes before Gorali. I was watching. Tesche looked at the 8 Drevathi community members at the entrance. She looked at the corridor Gorali would be coming from. She looked at Darrow. She said, I have this verbatim, oh, this is going to be a whole thing. Darrow said, yep. She rubbed her face with both hands, which I have come to understand is a human gestural indicator of reluctant preparation for something. Then, she walked over to Tesra and said, is the actual review board set up inside? Tesra said, since this morning. Tesche said, Gorali's people coming in? Tesra said, if the review proceeds per agreement, their representative is entitled to observe. Tesche said, okay. And, if they send the contractors instead of a representative? Tesra said, the agreement specifies a designated representative. Tesche looked at this information. You could see her doing it, processing it, turning it over. Then, she said, so if they come with contractors and not their designated rep, the review doesn't happen today and the agreement holds. Tesra said, that would be one interpretation. Tesche said, Gorali doesn't know that. Tesra said nothing. But, her expression, which I had 4 months of baseline on at that point, did something small and specific. Gorali arrived with 4 contractors and no designated representative. Tesche said, Mr. Gorali. Where's your legal designate? He said, what? She said, for the review board. The agreement requires a designated legal representative, not security personnel. Did you bring your legal representative? He said, they're here for, she said, I need the name of your designated representative for the board's records. She had a data pad. She was holding it in a way that suggested she was prepared to write something on it. She was not going to write anything on it. I am certain of this. But, she was holding it. Gorali looked at his contractors. His contractors did not have an answer to a data pad. He said, I was not informed of this requirement. Tesche said, it's in Section 4 of the Shared Services Agreement. I can pull it up if that would help. He said, I know. We'll need to reschedule. Tesche said, of course. The review office is in Suite 12, they can find a time that works. She wrote something on the data pad. What she wrote, I confirmed later, was, Gorali came with contractors. No legal rep, remind SGTK. He left. Tesra watched him go. Then, she looked at Tesche. Tesche said, Section 4? Tesra said, Section 4. Tesche said, good section. Tessera said something in Drevathi second dialect that my translation matrix handled as, "Your sergeant taught you this?" Tesche said, "Sergeant Course doesn't really teach. You just kind of," she made a gesture I cannot fully describe. It involved her hands moving outward from her chest, like something diffusing. "Absorb it." Tessera said, I filed my Day 11 report that evening. I included the T. I included the floor gambit, which I described more formally as behavioral disruption technique, nonverbal. I included the datapad. I included a section I titled Patterns Requiring Extended Analysis, which I had now used in every single report about this unit since Vet Station. My supervisor responded within 2 hours, which was unusual. She said, "Your Karev 7 behavioral documentation is being requested by the Strategic Planning Division. They want your original observation files, not the summaries." I said, "For what purpose?" She said, "They didn't specify." I said, "I'd like to know the purpose." She said, "I know you would. Send the files." I sent the files. Then, I sat in my observation suite for a long time with my coffee and thought about strategic planning having my files. Strategic planning is a phrase that means different things in different contexts. In the Valhari Cooperative, in the current political climate, with the Karev situation contained at its current level and 3 territorial claims still legally unresolved after 114 years, strategic planning meant something specific. It meant someone was thinking about what came next. I thought about Kors handing an old woman a cup of tea. I thought about Tesche on the floor, looking at the ceiling. I thought about the pile of garbage on Vet Station that wasn't garbage anymore. I made my 3rd coffee of the session. It tasted like bird bark soaked in regret and a low-grade anxiety I was choosing not to examine. I drank all of it. On day 14, 3 days after the review board non-event, I was doing routine sensor sweeps when I picked up an anomaly in the station's outer docking corridor. Movement pattern inconsistent with scheduled traffic. I flagged it and began tracking. It was Kors. He was alone. Off rotation, again. He was walking the perimeter of the station, not the intersections, the outer ring, the corridors that ran along the hull where the sound of the contested space outside came through the walls as a kind of background frequency that most beings found unpleasant. He walked slowly. He touched walls, sometimes. He stopped at viewports and looked out. I watched him do this for 40 minutes. He was not checking for threats. I have enough observation data on threat assessment behavior to recognize it. He was just looking. Being in the space. Learning its shape. At one point he stopped at a viewport and stood there for a long time, and I angled the sensor to get a better look at his face, and what I found there was not what I expected from a field sergeant 11 days into a contested zone assignment with 3 unresolved territorial claims and a day 11 situation in his file. He looked tired, yes. But underneath that, and I want to be precise, because I am always trying to be precise about things I cannot fully explain, he looked like he was thinking about something that had nothing to do with any of this. Something far away. Something that the hull viewport was not showing him but that he was looking at anyway, through the station and the contested space and the 114 years of unresolved claims, looking at something that was not here. I did not write anything in my log for several minutes. Then, I wrote, subject displays what appears to be homesickness. Or its functional equivalent. Or something that my vocabulary does not have a clean word for. The feeling of carrying a weight that has no tactical relevance and that cannot be put down. Filed as personal observation. Not for reporting. Not for reporting. I kept that one for myself. I was recalled to Valhari Prime 46 days into the Karev 7 posting. Not disciplined. Not reassigned. Recalled. There is a specific meaning to that word in cooperative administrative language. It means someone wants to talk to you, in person, with the kind of permanence that transmission logs do not provide. I spent the transit preparing. I went through my observation files. I reorganized my annotation system, which had become, over the Karev weeks, increasingly personal in a way that felt like it required some cleaning up before I presented it to anyone official. I removed several entries that were less analytical documentation and, more, I suppose the accurate word is wondering. Long strings of wondering that had attached themselves to specific moments. I removed them from the reporting files. I kept them in my personal archive. I drank terrible transit issue coffee that tasted like it had been made by someone who had only heard coffee described and done their best, and I thought about the thing that had happened on day 31 of the HFY posting, which I had not yet included in any report at all. Let me tell you about the Reth incident. The Reth were not a party to the HFY territorial dispute. They are a small species, perhaps 400,000 total population, spread thin across a handful of stations and colony installations in the Inner Rim, who had ended up on HFY approximately 30 years prior when a trade route collapsed and the community had nowhere financially viable to relocate. They operated a small service sector on the station. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful. They had, over 30 years, become excellent at being inconspicuous. On day 31, a HFY consortium logistics operation went wrong. I will spare the technical details because they are extensive and not the point. The short version, a pressurized transfer system on the station's cargo level failed during a HFY operation. The failure caused a cascade. The cascade reached a Reth community storage section that housed approximately 60% of the Reth community's food stores. The food stores were not salvageable. The HFY consortium's response, which I have in their internal comms, was, document the loss for insurance review. Note that the failure occurred in a non-HFY section. Proceed with primary operation. I want to be careful here. I am not editorializing. I am telling you what the comms said. The Reth community leader, an elderly female named Voreth, who I had not previously had much in my files because the Reth community had not been a factor in the territorial dispute, went to the HFY consortium's on-station representative. She was told, politely, that the consortium would conduct a full review of the incident and that she could file a formal claim which would be assessed in accordance with the applicable agreements. The applicable agreements would take between 8 and 14 months to process. The Reth community had food reserves for approximately 6 weeks. Voreth left the consortium office. I wrote, Reth community now an active resource crisis. Humanitarian concern. Flagging for Cooperative Oversight Committee action. The Cooperative Oversight Committee, as previously established, existed primarily in documentation. Course found out through Vaz, who found out through Tezche, who found out because Tezche had, I checked, she had actually done this, made a list of every community representative on the station in the first week of the posting and introduced herself to all of them. This is not in any protocol. This is not trained behavior. I asked her about it later, directly, in one of the brief conversations I was having by then, that technically violated my observation protocols. She said, I just wanted to know who was there. I said, why? She looked at me for a moment like I had asked why water was wet. Then, she said, so I'd know if something happened to them. I wrote that down later, in my personal archive, and, then, did not look at it for a week because it sat in my chest in a way I could not do anything useful with. Cours went to the HFY representative. His name was Counselor Rank Paris, which is a title that means he had enough institutional standing to be uncomfortable with being approached directly by anyone below his equivalent tier. He had spent most of the posting being carefully inaccessible. Cours did not have an appointment. I have the security camera footage. I have watched it many times. Cours walked into the HFY consortium's on-station offices, identified himself to the administrative staff, and said, I need to speak with Paris about the Reth situation. The administrative staff explained that Counselor Rank Paris was not available. Cours said, I'll wait. He sat down in the waiting area. He waited for 4 hours and 23 minutes. He did not do anything during that time. He did not look at a device. He did not make calls. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees, occasionally glancing at the administrative staff, who became, I can track this in the security feed, increasingly uncomfortable over the course of those 4 hours. Not afraid. Uncomfortable in the specific way of people who are trying to work normally around an anomaly they cannot process. Because he was not aggressive. He was not demanding. He was not performing impatience. He was just there. At 4 hours and 23 minutes, Paris came out. I do not have audio on the conversation that followed. The Thessi offices are shielded, which I had noted and accepted as a limitation of my observation suite. I have visual only. No lip read capacity for Thessi facial structure, and course was mostly in profile. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I can tell you what I observed. For the first 3 minutes, Paris was talking. His posture was the formal kind, the kind that makes itself tall to establish a hierarchy. His hands moved in a way consistent with the Thessi formal register gesture set, small, controlled, positioned for authority. Kors sat across from him with his hands folded. Around minute 4, something changed. Paris stopped moving his hands. He looked at something Kors apparently put on the table, I couldn't see what, and then he looked at Kors, and then he looked back at the thing on the table. At minute 7, Paris's posture changed. The formal height went out of it. Not collapse, not submission, just the specific kind of deflation that happens when someone who was prepared for an argument realizes no argument has been offered. At minute 11, Kors stood up. He extended his hand, the human gesture, flat, palm down. Paris, after a brief pause, placed his own hand against it in the approximation that Thessi used for that exchange. Kors left. I immediately cummed Vaz. I said, "What happened in there?" Vaz said, "Sir?" I said, "The Kors-Paris meeting." "What did the sergeant bring with him?" Vaz said, "Not really my place to." I said, "Please." There was a pause. Vaz said, "The consortium's liability parameters under their cooperative operating license. Cross-referenced with the specific failure classifications that would trigger mandatory remediation. And a summary of what 6 weeks of Reth food stores looks like against 14 months of claims processing." I said, "He did that research himself?" Vaz said, "He asked Tesche to pull the license files. Darrow did the claims processing timelines. Kors put it together." I said, "When?" Vaz said, "Last night. He was up until a pause. Late." I wrote, subject identified a legal vector. Did not use rank, force, or mandate. Used the other party's own liability structure as the argument. Did not require them to be generous. Required them to calculate correctly. The Thessi Consortium released an emergency interim food provision to the Reth community within 18 hours, pending the full claims review. Voreth, who I spoke with briefly 2 days later in the course of my observation rounds, said, "The young soldier came to see me." I said, "Kors?" She said, "He came to tell me what had been arranged." "He came himself." I said, "What did he say?" She looked at me for a moment. Then, she said, "He said I wanted you to hear it from a person." I wrote that down. I wanted you to hear it from a person. I have thought about that sentence on an unreasonable number of separate occasions. On day 37, I received a transmission from strategic planning. It was not a request. It was framed as a request, the way things from strategic planning are always framed. It asked me to prepare a consolidated pattern analysis brief on the 14th Expeditionary, with particular attention to tactical methodologies demonstrating scalable replication potential. Scalable replication potential. I knew what that meant. I had known, since my supervisor mentioned strategic planning had my files, that this was the direction things were moving. The cooperative had a peacekeeping mandate in Kharkiv and a containment strategy that had now been contained at the same level for 114 years, and, somewhere in the planning division, someone had looked at my reports and thought, "Here is a different way to do this." They wanted to know if what Kors did could be packaged, taught, deployed, replicated in other contexts with other units. I sat with the transmission for 3 days before I responded. Here is what I wrote back. To Strategic Planning, Velhari Cooperative from Strategic Observer Sarajevo 1, 3rd Designation Re, Consolidated Pattern Analysis Request, 14th Expeditionary Human Unit. I have been observing Sergeant Kors and his unit for approximately 112 days across 2 postings. I have filed 14 substantive reports. I have flagged 43 individual behavioral patterns for extended analysis. I have a personal archive with 3 times that many notes that I have not filed because they are not cleanly reportable. I can tell you what I have observed. I cannot tell you how to replicate it. What I have documented is not a methodology. It is not a training protocol or a tactical system. It is what appears to happen when a particular kind of person, shaped by a particular kind of life, with a particular relationship to other beings and to the concept of what matters, exists in a situation that would normally be handled with force or legal process or prolonged bureaucratic attrition. He brought an old woman tea because he knew she would want it and because it was the thing that was actually true about the situation. He sat in a waiting room for 4 hours because he had decided the conversation was going to happen. He told a Reth community leader that she should hear good news from a person. I do not know how to teach someone to be the kind of person who does these things. I suspect if you tried to teach it, you would produce something that looked like these things from the outside and was entirely hollow on the inside, and that the beings it was performed at would know the difference immediately. What I can tell you, if it is useful, is this: every situation I have observed where his presence changed an outcome involved the same underlying movement. He identified what was actually true about the situation, not the tactical truth, not the legal truth, but the human truth, which is the truth about what beings need and what they're afraid of and what they could accept and still feel like themselves, and he addressed that directly. That is not a tactic. That is a way of seeing. I am not able to tell you how to distribute it. End of brief. I sent it. Strategic planning did not respond for 9 days. When they did, the response said, "Thank you for your assessment. We are pursuing parallel research avenues." I wrote in my log, "They found someone who will tell them it can be replicated." This is how we end up with hollow things. On day 44, 2 days before my recall, I was on a routine sensor sweep when I caught something. The station's outer ring, the whole corridor where I had watched Kors walking alone on day 14. He was there again. Same slow walk. Same hand occasionally touching the wall. I watched him for a few minutes. Then, I did something I had not done in any previous observation session. I went down there. I want to be precise, I did not have a premeditated reason. I was not gathering data. I was not conducting a planned contact interaction. I walked to the outer ring corridor and I turned the corner and he was there, standing at a viewport, and he heard me and turned around. He looked at me. I said, "I wanted to say, before my recall, that I have been observing your unit for 112 days. He said, "I know." I said, "I filed a report to strategic planning. I told them I didn't think what you do can be taught." He looked at me for a moment. His expression did a thing I wrote down afterward as uncertain whether to be amused or something more complicated. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "I have 43 flagged behavioral patterns and 3 times that in personal notes, and the honest answer is I don't fully know. But I think it involves seeing people." He looked back at the viewport. He said, "That's a very small thing to build a report around." I said, "Most of the things I've filed are small things." There was a pause. He said, "Why does strategic planning want to know?" I said, "Because Karev has been contained at the same level for 114 years and someone has decided it's time to try something different." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, "How many people are in the Reth community on Karev 7? I said, "Approximately 460. He said, "How many on the other Karev stations?" I looked that up. I hadn't had it available. I said, "Across all 6, approximately 2,300. He said, "Okay." He looked at the viewport again. I said, "I wanted to tell you what you did for them. The food. The liability research. I wanted you to hear it from a person." He turned back to look at me. I said, "I don't have a frame for it. I've been trying to build one for 4 months. But I think it mattered in a way that my reports don't fully capture, and I wanted to say that directly." He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "There are 2,300 Reth in Karev and nobody solved Karev in 114 years. I said, no. He said, has anyone asked the ref what they need? I opened my mouth. Closed it. Went through, mentally, every report I had. Every strategic brief. Every 114 years of documented containment strategy. He watched me do this. He said, I don't mean that as a critique. I genuinely don't know. I said, I don't know either. He nodded. He turned back to the viewport. I stood there for a moment. Then, I said, I'm going to include that in my personal archive. He said, what? I said, the question. Has anyone asked the ref what they need? I'm going to put it in my personal archive. He said, not your official report? I said, I think it's too large for my official report. He looked at me in that uncertain, amused way again. Then, he said, the tea preparation at the next junction is still better than it looks. I said, I know. I was recalled the following day. Not 2 days later, the scheduling changed and I didn't have a chance to go back to the outer ring corridor. On the transport, I organized my files. I finalized the strategic planning brief. I kept my personal archive separate, password locked, flagged as non-reportable. By the time I reached Velhari Prime, I had added 119 new entries to the personal archive. The most recent was 8 words, has anyone asked the ref what they need? The debriefing on Velhari Prime took 3 days. I met with 4 different committees. I presented my behavioral documentation, my pattern analysis, my tactical summaries. I was told, by a counselor in the Upper Strategic Committee, that my work represented a significant contribution to the cooperative's understanding of human operational parameters. I said, I'm not sure I understand them. I've documented them. He said, that is exactly what we required. I said, I included a recommendation that we review the REF community situation across all CAREF stations. He said, yes, we saw that. It's been forwarded to the appropriate committee. I said, which committee? He said, the Humanitarian Resource Review Committee. I said, how long does that committee's process typically take? There was a pause. He said, 18 to 24 months. I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, I see. I did not say anything else in that meeting. The council convened a review board on human integration protocols 4 months after my recall. I was invited to present. I prepared extensively. I reviewed everything. I organized. I rebuilt my argument from the foundation up, in the clean analytical language of cooperative policy briefings, in the tiers and frameworks and scalable replication terminology that strategic planning had wanted. And then, the night before the presentation, I opened my personal archive. 163 entries. Tea that an old woman would want. A soldier sitting on a floor looking at the ceiling. 11 seconds of hesitation at a corridor entrance. A protein bar on a parley table. I wanted you to hear it from a person. Has anyone asked the ref what they need? I sat with that for a long time. Then, I wrote my presentation over. Not in the clean analytical language. In the only language I had that was accurate. The council's first question, when I finished, was, why do you think other species fear them? I had been expecting this question. It is the question everyone gets to eventually, looking at the data. 43 species in the cooperative. 43 different responses to human presence ranging from mild wariness to what the Drevathi commander had demonstrated 11 seconds at a corridor entrance, unable to move, reading something in the stillness that his tactical training could not name. I said, I don't think it's fear exactly. The counselor said, then, what? I said, I think it is the feeling you get when you realize that someone else can see the room you're both standing in, and they can see it more completely than you can, and they are going to act on that complete picture, and you don't yet know what that action will be. There was a silence. I said, that feeling is not fear. But, it's not comfortable either. And, I think most species, when they encounter it, categorize it as fear because fear is a category they have. Disorientation in front of someone who sees better is not a category they have. The counselor said, "And what do you recommend the council do with this assessment?" I thought about cores at the viewport. I thought about the question he'd asked me. I said, I recommend the council ask the Reth what they need. And, then, I recommend you ask that question about every community in Karev that hasn't been asked it in 114 years of containment strategy. The counselor said, that is not exactly a policy recommendation. I said, no. It's a beginning. They thanked me for my presentation. They filed my reports. They assigned a follow-up research committee. I was offered a reassignment to a senior observer post in Velhari Prime's Central Analytics Division. Better resources. Higher tier. No more field postings. I took 4 days to think about it. Then, I filed a request to return to field observation. My supervisor asked why. I said, incomplete pattern analysis. She said, you've been saying that for 2 years. I said, yes. She said, when will the pattern be complete? I thought about that. I thought about 163 entries in a personal archive. I thought about Tezche on the floor looking at the ceiling. I thought about the pile of garbage that wasn't garbage anymore. I thought about a young Drevathi male standing very still while a human medic redressed his wound and, not knowing what to do with his hands. I said, I don't think it will be complete. I think it's the kind of pattern that keeps growing. She approved the request. I made my coffee. I opened a new log. There is a file. You know this. I told you at the beginning. It is restricted. It is restricted because 47 years ago, the first Velhari observer to document extended human contact in a contested zone setting wrote something in her final report that the council read and, then, quietly buried in the restricted tier, and that report has been there ever since, growing slowly as people with clearance find it and read it and add their own annotations and, then, go back to their assignments and don't talk about it. I have read it. The final line of the original report, written by an observer named Vethralasan, who spent 11 years documenting human presence in the early joint operation era, reads, the subject population appears to operate from the belief that every individual they encounter is, in some meaningful sense, theirs to be responsible for. Not in an ownership sense. In the sense of, this being is here, I am here, and, what happens to them is therefore a fact I am part of. I do not know what to do with this finding. I suspect the council will not know either. I am including it anyway. I read that line for the first time 6 months ago. I have read it every day since. Not because I know what to do with it. Because I think she was right that it's the kind of thing that has to be included anyway. Even if no one knows what to do with it yet. My coffee is cold. I have been talking for a long time. The session log is 47 pages. Somewhere I checked before I started this session, before I made the first cup, the 14th Expeditionary is currently deployed in the Harith system, which has its own unresolved situation, its own 100-year containment strategy, its own communities that may or may not have been asked what they need. I do not know what is happening there right now. I will find out. I always find out.